Hello, and welcome to On Second Thought, a bonus series from And the Runner-Up Is. On June 6th, 2018, I released the episode of And the Runner-Up Is on the 2005 Best Picture race, where Eric Anderson and I discussed Brokeback Mountain as the runner-up that lost Best Picture to Crash. But on second thought, what if the runner-up was really Capote?
I'm going to help find you a proper lawyer.
Thank you.
His brother and his sister killed themselves.
Did you tell him your mama did the same thing?
If those boys get off, I'm coming to Brooklyn to hunt you down.
They're torturing me.
He says it's the nonfiction book of the decade.
We still haven't talked about that night.
What's the name of your book?
I can't finish till I know what happens. The world will see you as a monster. I don't want that. I've decided on a title for my book. In Cold Blood. Isn't that good?
Welcome back to On Second Thought, a bonus series from And the Runner-Up Is, where we talk about another Best Picture nominee that could have potentially been a runner-up to the Best Picture winner. I'm Kevin Jacobson, and today I have two wonderful people back on the show with me. First off, you last heard this guy talking with me about Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf and the Oscar year of 1966 from the Film Experience and the This Had Oscar Buzz podcast, in addition to many other bylines. Chris Feil.
Hi.
Hello.
I am excited to not be the Earth Mother and you not be all flops
Yes.
being back on.
How about that? And my other guest is no stranger to this show. You first heard her talking Little Miss Sunshine in the films of 2006, The Piano in the films of 1993, and Star Wars in the films of 1977, as well as another episode of On Second Thought about The Big Short from Awards Circuit, Citizen Dame, The Watch and Talk, also has many different credits. Please welcome back Karen Peterson.
Hello.
Hello, aren't we all excited to be talking about a movie I think we all love? And that is Capote.
Love.
So excited.
Yes, all right. So we are indeed talking about Capote, wondering if it could have potentially been in the conversation for Best Picture to win over Crash. And we will get to a little bit of that a little later. So, Capote is a biopic that tells the story of the acclaimed author and public figure Truman Capote and his experience researching his famous nonfiction book In Cold Blood. So after learning about this infamous case of the Clutter family being murdered on their Kansas farm in 1959, we basically watch how Truman and his childhood friend and fellow author Harper Lee travel down to Kansas to research the case, and Truman, I should say, takes particular interest in one of the murderers, Perry Smith, who he kind of finds himself identifying with. And Capote is using his wealth and his influence to gain access to Perry whatever he wants, and tries to help him, as well as his partner in crime, Dick Hickok, get an appeal. And so we see how Capote really struggles with the emotional toll of writing such a dark story, and also just kind of coming to terms with his own narcissism and childhood traumas. So the film was directed by Bennett Miller in his narrative feature debut, and written by Dan Futterman, who adapted Gerald Clark's biography Capote. And it stars Philip Seymour Hoffman as Capote, Catherine Keener as Harper Lee, Clifton Collins Jr. as Perry Smith, Mark Pellegrino as Dick Hickok, Chris Cooper, Amy Ryan, Bob Balaban, Bruce Greenwood, and Marshall Bell. So Capote made $28 million at the U.S. box office, was nominated for 5 Academy Awards, winning 1, but not Best Picture. So Capote, I think, is one of those films where the performance at the center is largely what gets most of the attention. But it was able to get into the Best Picture conversation as well. So I want us to give our general thoughts, of course, but one of the things I specifically want to know from each of you is if there are elements to this film, like outside of that central Philip Seymour Hoffman performance, that stand out to you, whether on a screenwriting or directing or technical level. So let's start with Chris. What are your general thoughts on this?
I mean, I love this movie particularly in the way that it kind of operates somewhat outside of the biopic rules. I think I mean, obviously, if you're discussing fame, Truman Capote is a really interesting subject to discuss, like the nature of fame, especially in terms of like the narcissistic elements of it, because he was a famous, noted narcissist and fame whore. And I think the movie really kind of gets at that and kind of gets at the toll of the creative process in a way that's interesting that like I think people probably look at this movie a lot like a really standard biopic and I think it's operating on a little bit more nuanced levels than that, while at the same time it is somewhat standard, or it's like at least a slice of life type of biopic. And I find that really interesting and always potent to like rewatch in this movie.
And how about you, Karen?
I remember seeing this in the theater with a friend, and it was one of the earliest years that I was trying to see all the Best Picture nominees before the Oscars. And I remember we watched it, and as soon as it was over, we drove right across the street to Barnes and Noble and went in and bought In Cold Blood because we were so blown away by the story, and we just wanted to know more, and we wanted to know it from Truman Capote's own words. And it was such an interesting experience because for me, this film really, as much as it's easy to focus on what Philip Seymour Hoffman does, there's so much good to this. The script is really well done. The atmosphere of it, I think that everything about this just really brings you into Capote's world in a way that feels very, I mean, as Chris was saying, he was known as a narcissist. He has all kinds of stories. I mean, our first introduction to him in the film is him telling stories about, James Baldwin. And, but there's just something so much more introspective in the way that we really get to know him, and getting to see and experience him through other people around him, I think was such a great choice. And this film just really, it moved me in unexpected ways. And I think that watching, especially, I mean, as much as we praise him and he's fantastic, Philip Seymour Hoffman, I think that all the performances around him are really good too, especially Clifton Collins Jr. as Perry. So yeah, I love this film.
Yeah, so I think seeing Philip Seymour Hoffman in this totally transformative performance is what brought me to Capote, and is probably still the most noteworthy aspect of the film for a lot of people. And I have to say, like, watching it 10 or so years ago, I liked his performance, but there was like a chilliness to the film that I didn't really respond to as much at the time. I was like 16 or 17 at the time when I first saw it, but I found myself on this rewatch really being drawn in by this story and how it tells this story. I think it's something that Bennett Miller would kind of do similarly again later with Foxcatcher. Not as effectively, in my opinion, but Capote, I think, is stronger in that regard. But I just feel like the way it's told, it's so subtle, and it sort of proceeds at this deliberate pace that just sort of untangles in front of you. And it's sort of like hypnotic and engrossing in a way. And that's kind of how I would describe this film. I think it's able to get to like the heart of what happens when a writer, an artist, becomes obsessed with the thing that they're writing about, and how it just starts to consume them. And I say them, but I really mean like, we're all writers here, and I think we understand what it's like to kind of get involved in something that we're really passionate about, that it just kind of takes over your whole life. And it can sometimes get in the way of like personal relationships, as we see with how like Truman insists on staying in Kansas while his boyfriend is kind of annoyed from afar, and we see it like when he's attending the premiere of To Kill a Mockingbird, and he can't even stop to think about the fact that his best friend is having this big moment. He's just consumed with himself. So those are the moments that I find to be really smart about this film, about how artists can create these masterful pieces of work and it's also being around an artist with that kind of an obsessive and somewhat self-centered sort of nature. You kind of have to make concessions, you know, and you can be put off by some of their selfishness sometimes.
And self-destructiveness.
Yeah. And, you know, I'm not saying that people should just accept that just because they're artists, you know, but I think the film shows that dynamic very well, of how, despite his flaws, there are still these people in his life that want to be around him, and they can be annoyed at first, and you see that in their faces, but they do sort of accept it at a certain point. So I think that's really smart.
Well, and it translates to the audience experience too, because this is a character that isn't necessarily a likable person. He's the kind of person that in real life would probably annoy me to some degree. And yet he's so compelling to watch, and you just get so pulled into his experience. And I think that it's really a great work by Hoffman, but also, as you mentioned, by Bennett Miller, the director. And I completely agree with you when you talk about Foxcatcher and how he tried to do similar things but not as successfully. Yeah. I think that there's something particular about Truman Capote's story that really resonates.
There's a certain emotional intelligence to it too, where I think the movie is conscious of those like peculiar character traits for Truman Capote, in particularly this passage of his life, and you know, the way that he was, it's not self-harm, but the way that he is kind of putting himself in an emotional place that is very much taking a toll on him, his like physical body and his mental health and that type of thing. And like, it's very clear that that is like a take and an examination that Philip Seymour Hoffman and Bennett Miller are doing in this movie that I think really kind of takes it to the next level of character study, closer to probably something we would see that is purely based in fiction than we would normally see in a standard biopic.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I do want to dig deeper into this central performance here, because what Philip Seymour Hoffman does, I think, is pretty extraordinary, because I'm someone who's pretty hot and cold when it comes to some, you know, actors who are playing these larger than life figures, because half the time, you know, I just kind of see the tics and the mannerisms, and I don't really feel that sense that I'm really seeing an authentic character so much as just an actor who's trying very hard to be that person.
And if you were already like as someone who is a larger than life and had those mannerisms and tics, that we have a bevy of footage of this person, it's Truman Capote.
Exactly.
In the cultural lexicon, at least.
Right.
It's like it could have been that.
Right.
Yeah. I remember seeing the trailers for the film and thinking, oh, I don't know if I can watch 2 hours of him. And it was like, I mean, because the way that he speaks, and not just the sound of his voice, but the very slow, methodical way that he speaks, everything about it.
Oh, yeah.
But it was like, once the movie started, I just kind of was pulled so into it so easily that all of that just dropped by the wayside, and I didn't really think about it much.
Yeah.
And I think that speaks to a whole other level of this performance too, because like everything you just said was true of Truman Capote too. That's a lot of the ways that he was perceived by the public, that it's like this like squeaky sounding man who was short, homosexual, very homosexual at a time when that was not embraced, but was still able to like win over people in a way that they weren't expecting. And I mean, the movie goes into that a little bit too, but like that Philip Seymour Hoffman was also able to capture that part of it, I think speaks to this whole other level that this performance is doing that's so captivating.
And I think at first you do have to adjust a little bit to the voice he's doing, just a little bit, like at that party scene when we're first introduced to him. But as the film goes along, I think he just totally disappears, and it just feels like you're watching Truman Capote, like it's an unknown playing him or something. And there's that moment for me when I think it's when Perry is confessing about the murders to him finally, and he's just listening. And he takes off his glasses at one point, and I'm like, oh my God, that's Philip Seymour Hoffman. And I just like remembered now. I think it's a amazing performance, and you can look at it on the surface, and if you've never seen the real Truman Capote before, you can think, oh, he's overdoing it with the voice and the sort of affectations, but yes, that is who he was. That is who Truman Capote presented himself as in public. If you watch these old interviews with him, he just nails that voice exactly, and he just like totally encompasses so much of who he was. So yeah,
you see other performances where someone's playing someone that has a very particular manner of speaking, or like you had mentioned, the little tics or things, and it definitely can stand out, and it can really feel like, wow, they're trying so hard to do an impression, and this didn't feel like an impression. It felt like he really embodied Truman Capote to give this performance that was deep and meaningful.
Absolutely. And I also think that there is a very strong, almost mystery element in the first half of the film about just what it is that is capturing his imagination about this murder case, and like what could inspire him to write this book about it. And again, I like how the film it takes its time to sort of parse that out, and showing how much Truman identifies with Perry as someone who had this rough childhood, and they both had to really struggle quite a bit growing up. And that's something that Truman actually says throughout the film, especially when he's kind of being that sort of manipulative guy trying to get what he wants, is he just always brings up, that he has struggled to fit in. People judge him. They think he's this or that, but he's misunderstood, and he's a lot more complicated. And he has this artistic sort of flair to him, and Perry is the same way. So I like how that dynamic is teased out.
One of the things I really like about when Truman first arrives in Kansas and he meets Alvin, Dewey, and he tells him, it doesn't matter to me if you solve the case or not. I'm just here because I think this is an interesting story, and I want to know what this murder has done, or these murders have done to this town. And then Dewey says to him, I care if we solve this. And it's just such an interesting look at, you've got this outsider who's coming in to tell this story that he really doesn't understand, even though it's weird because he's from a small town, and so he should have some understanding of what an event like this does to a community. But I think it's such an interesting way to establish that he does have a little bit of work to do to ingratiate himself with these folks, and to watch that journey unfold, I think is really great, the way that they do it.
For a movie that I think that scene especially kind of pinpoints what some of this movie is doing in really subtle ways. I'm surprised, because it's a movie made largely by heterosexual men, that it kind of pinpoints the way that gay people operate under a different language than, I think, especially cultures that are not accustomed to gay people, and seeing the world in a different way because of that. I think that's a really interesting scene that always makes me think of that.
Yeah, and there is this dynamic to the film of Truman's connection to Perry that is, like, you don't know where the line is of how they're connecting. Essentially, it never really becomes physical, but there's this intense emotional bond there. And there's that brilliant line where Harper Lee is asking him, whether he's fallen in love with Perry, and he just says, like, it's as if we started life in the same house. He walked out the back door and I walked out the front, that sort of thing. I'm always struck by, like, the emotional bond that they create together. And I think Clifton Collins Jr. is fantastic. I already tweeted about this today, and a lot of people are agreeing. Like, he's...
That was something that never really materialized in that Oscar year, like a supporting actor play for him, that, like, I was just sitting around waiting, like, when is some awards group going to mention him, and it just never really happened, at least with none of the major precursors.
I believe he got a Gold Derby Award nomination. I will have you know. So we were on the ball.
Well, yeah, I remember during that season, before I had had a chance to see it, everyone was talking about, well, maybe this is strong enough that Catherine Keener can come in and get a nomination too. And then it happened. And when I finally saw it, I think the nominations were already out when I saw the movie. And so when I watched it and I was like, wait a second, why was everyone making such a big deal about Catherine Keener, who's also great? I love her, don't get me wrong. But nobody was saying a word about Clifton Collins Jr. And I could not understand it, because I think apart from Philip Seymour Hoffman, he's the best thing about this film. And I think that Hoffman's performance, while amazing, would not have been nearly as good without Clifton Collins Jr. I think the two of them elevate this so well that they really bring each other to such a great place.
Absolutely. And it is a shame that he didn't get any traction, because he is just so natural, and you see that haunted look in his eyes, you know, and I think he kind of threads the needle of like someone who really appreciates the affection that Truman is giving him. And it's hard to say if he necessarily loved Truman, but he is just so grateful to have someone looking out for him, you know, when everyone else in his life is pretty much checked out and abandoned him. And that confession scene, I think, is so incredible for him. It's like chilling, it's heartbreaking, and he just fills it with so much emotion that you can't help but feel a little bit of compassion for this murderer, you know? I think it's an extraordinary scene.
Have either of you guys read the book?
No, I was also going to ask
Blood,
that.
yes, in like high school, so it's been a while.
Yeah. I think that anybody who reads the book and sees this film and sees what he does as Perry, he is able to really show things that, like, just this, like you mentioned, the haunted look in his face and just the way that he reacts to things. It's like you can just see in him this long past of abuse and violence and things and victimhood that ended up putting him in this situation that was almost fated. I don't know if that's really the right word, but it's like once you know Perry's whole story and you really dig into that, it's like it just makes what Clifton did just that much more incredible, because I think that he shows so much depth and so much history without actually having to or getting to bring some of that material to the screen.
Yeah, absolutely. I wish there was, like, I know he's on Westworld, you know, I just wish that there was like some sort of resurgence for him and his talent as an actor, because this is such a clear highlight that shows what he's capable of. But yeah. I do also want to get to Catherine Keener, because she does get a nomination here. First of all, it's been established I love Catherine Keener. She is canonically my mother. So I just, I have to support my family. She's just everything that any great Catherine Keener performance has, which is just kind of exuding that sense of warmth and compassion and friendship. And she makes such a great sort of dynamic duo pairing for the two of them together. It's like True Detective before True Detective happened. Like they just work so well together.
It's a real sense of like chemistry and history, and like with a real like economy of time and words of establishing just their history together as friends, and obviously knowing Truman's harder histories and his history of abuse, and having a certain shared language between the two of them and getting out of the place where they lived. I mean, like, that all feels kind of nebulous to describe in a performance, but when you see it really come alive in the way that she can do that, and obviously with a scene partner that she'd worked with a lot and would continue to work with, it's just a beautiful performance. And I feel like it's the type of performance that people talk about like it was just carried along with his performance in the movie. And I think both of those things don't prove to be true, because like she was nominated by all of the major precursors. The movie was being awarded as well. Yeah, I think her performance is largely undervalued, except for like maybe people like us who adore her.
Yeah, Kevin, was it you that had the Twitter thread about coattail nominees?
Yes, this actually
Okay.
watching Catherine Keener inspired me to tweet this about
Okay,
who
I
do you
thought that
think
was
is
yours.
like who do you
Right.
think people talk about like, oh, they just got in because of, you know, a lead nomination or because the movie was strong, but really like their performances like this have a lot more into them than what people say about them. But yes, go on.
Well, exactly. That's exactly my point. And when I saw that tweet thread, I started thinking about this one even more and just how over the years, and I don't think at the time it was considered as much to be a coattail nomination, but over the years, that's kind of the narrative that has been written about it. And it's like, no, if you really watch what she's doing, and as you guys have said, I mean, the way that she's able to bring this really, really deep, very long friendship, because the two of them had known each other since they were children, Nell and Truman. And I mean, what they do together is just so beautiful and so powerful that to just say that her nomination was just because of his or just because of the success of the film is such a disservice to her and to her abilities, because she's really gifted and so good in this role.
Yeah.
Well, and I think some of it goes to like what gets valued and when we talk about performances and that type of thing. And like what we've just described, like she does so well with this role. She's playing Harper Lee, we should mention. It is like it's not easy to describe, and it's also not easy to describe why it's good.
True.
On top of already being not what tends to like be valued. Like I think a lot of the performances she's nominated against this year are much bigger performances. That's easy to like pinpoint why it's good, you know.
Thank you for listening to this preview of On Second Thought, a bonus series from And the Runner-Up Is. If you liked what you heard and want to hear more, please go to patreon.com/andtherunnerup.is and become a patron. Only $3 a month will get you access to bonus episodes, a Slack channel, and early access to regular episodes. Thank you so much for your consideration.